Hey, Slayer. The words came through the VR helm that the young man was wearing. I told you not to call me that anymore, chubby genius, replied Electron, with a little extra disdain than was originally warranted due to the loud distraction that the words provided from the plethora of shapes, vectors, and symbols surrounding him in 3D space. Fine, Electron, and sorry for breaking your concentration, knowing why the reply from Electron was as hostile in tone as it was. But this is really important. That was enough to entirely break Electron's focus. He flung his arms back and forth a couple of times and made another gesture to bring his caller's avatar into the 3D space with him. A scrawny yet ominously cloaked figure appeared before Electron with the name Philosopher King floating above their head. You just made me lose 4 hours of work on this logic flow level. This better be good, Electron hostily stated. Ellie, listen, I beat the level 2 hours ago, said the Philosopher King flatly. What? We've been working on that level for 2 years. Aren't you excited? Why aren't you telling me this until just now? Electron exclaimed back, the sentences all and questions all running together. Before the words were finished, the reply came. I know, and trust me, I am excited, but something really weird happened in the real world. You're kidding, right? Have you been working on humor again? Because that isn't funny, Phil. It's just ridiculous. No, you don't understand. I know this sort of thing never happens, but it did, to me, just now. I think it might be a real adventure, replied Phil with nervousness and excitement surrounding the edges of his voice. Ellie didn't know what to say to that. He could clearly hear that Phil wasn't just in jest. Did something really happen? What could it be? As far as Phil was concerned, nothing interesting even could happen in the real world. As a hint of nervousness and fear arose within Phil now, he managed to ask in a slightly distorted tone from what he intended, What is it? It'd be easier if you just came and saw for yourself. What, you mean in person? Ellie laughed back. Yes, just come over, please. Phil and Ellie had known each other for their entire life. They were in the same baby group and helped each other through the standard education that all children received until they were 12. Not that either of them needed help, but the peer-to-peer interaction allowed them to complete school in far less time than it otherwise would have taken, allowing for more time for their pastime games and activities, which seemed more interesting than school was. Unfortunately, they were given houses many miles apart from one another, despite their mother's houses being practically next door. Transportation on Planet Zero, as they called it, was easy enough. Just use your augmented reality, AR glasses, to summon a transport, strap yourself in, and it goes to your destination. It used to be fun reclining in the transport with the transparent dome above, watching the city fly by, but the excitement had died off after the first few trips. The city was nearly perfectly uniform, so there wasn't really much to look at. House units were stacked 8 high and 8 wide as far as the eye could see. They were all identical and simply looked like off-white walls from the perspective of the transport provided. The pathways that formed a grid throughout the city were hardly any contrast. They were only simple metal surfaces that were just a bit shinier than the walls. While there were some buildings that were used for other purposes, namely the medical center and various exercise centers that couldn't be replicated in VR space, even those buildings looked the same from the outside. There was no longer any need for the retail, the restaurants, or any other service centers that existed in the old world, and the inhabitants of Planet Zero knew no different. But Ellie was too busy considering what could have happened at Phil's house to observe his surroundings today. In fact, the miles passed quite quickly, and he felt the transport slowing down to a stop before he knew it. The only other time he had come over to Phil's house was to share meals, but those times had become more irregular since they grew up beyond the graduated age of 12. He stepped out of the transport pod, and it instantly floated off to its next destination. The wall directly in front of Ellie opened, revealing Phil inside his house. The houses were small, compact spaces, and would be hardly comfortable if more than one person was expected to live in them. Each of the walls acted as storage, hiding away some component necessary for living, cooking equipment, a place to sleep, and of course the pastime systems that could all be accessed by these could all be accessed by opening or closing various components of the house. Phil had everything put up when Ellie entered. Even his VR headset and activity surface were put away. "Come in, friend," Phil said quietly. Ellie entered, and the door automatically rematerialized behind him. And there it was, a gaping hole in the floor, about 2 feet in diameter, with what appeared to be its hinged lid propped open. Black darkness, starkly contrasting everything that Ellie or Phil had seen in the real world. Both were silent, staring down at the floor. It was some kind of tunnel, and the upper rungs of the ladder within the hole could be seen. Ellie's heart rate increased as the reality of the matter sunk in, adrenaline and fear coursing through him from head to toe. It was several moments before either spoke. "What happened?" Ellie intoned, the very sound seeming to be sucked down the darkness of the pit. Phil managed an easier reply, as the initial shock of the matter had already subsided in him. "Well, you see," Phil replied, I beat the logic flow level that everyone thought was unbeatable, and I freaked out. I started, dancing and jumping around, and I tripped on something, or I fell down. I'm not really sure, but I hit my head on the ground. I might have even passed out. But when I opened my eyes, there was a seam, like a little ridge on the floor." "Phil, this is more than a seam. What did you do? Wouldn't you normally call maintenance for something like that?" Ellie asked. "Well, sure, normally I would, but I was so excited, and the seam hadn't been there before. I'm sure of it. I was so confused that the rubbery surface that all the wall surfaces are normally coated in would just distort like that. I knew something was wrong underneath it. Something was different in the floor. So I decided to take a look for myself before calling maintenance. I just cut the rubber along the line of the seam and found this hidden door thing, like there might be in an adventure game. I opened it, and here it is, this hole. I freaked out some more, and then I called you," Phil said calmly, happy to summarize the situation so cleanly. Several more moments of silence passed. Then Phil spoke up again. "So, are you ready to go?" "What? No way!" Ellie shouted back. "Hush! Shh, shh," Phil said, trying to calm Ellie down. "Nobody else can know about this for now. Not before we understand what's going on." "Fine," said Ellie, "but I don't see why you would want to go down that thing. It seems incredibly dangerous." "What? You don't want to go adventuring in the real world? What's the point of all this pastime and being the best at logic flow and all the school we got if we're never going to do anything for real?" replied Phil in a slightly exasperated tone. Ellie was beginning to calm down from the initial shock and realized that Phil was probably right. But it's not like they were never going to do real stuff. They were as likely as any to get recruited for the high-intelligence jobs if the pastime games were any indication. "We will do real stuff, just not yet. You know as well as any that people don't get called to jobs that until they're older than we are." "Oh, come on. I've heard stories from others in pastime who have jobs that they're not anything special. Only the people who go to other colonies get to adventure. Sure, a job is better than doing nothing, but not much. This is our chance, probably our only chance to have a real adventure." Ellie still needed a bit more convincing, but it was his own words that did the job. "I guess we don't have to go that far anyways, if it is dangerous," Ellie said. "But how will we see in the dark?" A big grin came across Phil's face. "That's the spirit," he said. "I wondered the same thing, but when I had tried to check the hole for any info using my AR glasses, I could see pretty far down. It's like they have night vision, like in some of the pastime games." "Really?" replied Ellie, kneeling to investigate the hole with his AR glasses on. "Huh, that really does work. I guess we never needed to see in the dark before now." The boys collected some supplies before beginning the descent. It was nearly a half-hour journey of climbing before the scenery changed at all. A few words of casual complaint and thanks for the fitness levels that they maintained were the only break from the seemingly endless ladder. "I don't know if we should keep going. We might not be strong enough to climb back up," said Ellie, worriedly, and beginning to show signs of being short of breath. Phil, who went down first, looked down and said, "No, look, we're almost at the bottom." Soon enough, the boys were standing on a dusty surface, the likes they had never seen before. The AR glasses did wonders in the pitch blackness, providing a little light and amplifying it greatly so the boys could see well enough despite the encompassing pitch blackness. Indeed, there was no light at all. It was like stepping into an entirely different planet. Dirt, dust, and decay were hardly a concept where they lived, yet this place was full of it. Looking around, the boys could see several things that simply took their breath away. Huge buildings were crumbling, and exotic shapes of various old-world attractions were decaying all around them. The ground was unlevel and chaotic. Metal and stone-like debris littered the floor, and only vague sounds like dripping water and the occasional crack or crunch could be heard in the distance, echoing through the vast expanse. Rifts in the ground were open in various places, leading even deeper down. Huge piles of rubble littered the landscape, each shape being too irregular and vague to make out. It was effectively a grayscale world, since the AR glasses couldn't make out much of the little color that remained. If Phil and Ellie had felt fear before, when they saw the pit initially, then only sheer terror and panic could describe what they felt now. The long journey down had helped themselves steel their nerves to some extent as they overcame the initial hurdle of beginning the journey, but now the length of the way down only seemed to reinforce their separation from the world above. Each of the boys now fantasized about what monster was about to leap out from behind that mound of rubble, or what alien would crawl up from the rifts in the earth. If it wasn't for the encouragement of each other being there, either of them would have fled the stark scene. After nearly a minute of looking around themselves, rotating their vision slowly around the area to where the ladder met the ground, Phil whispered forth into the darkness, "Wow." The word was as startling a sound to both of them. But soon they resumed some semblance of normal dialogue. The boys discussed various parts of the environment around themselves in awe and wonder for some time, before deciding to begin walking. "This way looks safest. Let's explore a little before heading back," said Ellie. "Sure, but I'm going to make some sort of map for this AR thing. Hold on," Phil said. After a few minutes of programming his AR glasses, using his eyes and mind to interface with the computer, he shared a sort of mini-map with Ellie. A short laugh came from Ellie when it came up on his display. "Wow, you really are treating this like a game," Ellie said with a hint of sarcasm. "If it's useful in a game, it's useful here," retorted Phil. In this manner, they continued, exploring the underworld for some time. After a few hours had passed, the boys returned to the ladder and slowly returned to the surface, completely exhausted. Laying on the floor, Phil said in between breaths, "We really can't let anyone know about this." "Yeah," said Ellie, also breathless. "We have to come back and explore this place more. We need some code word for when you're coming over," Phil said, after sitting up. He rose back to his feet and shut the trap door over the hole, surprisingly veiling it from existence. The floor retained a sort of crease in it, a dark seam, but hardly noticeable. "Darkness," Ellie said. "Darkness? Well, I guess that works," Phil replied. Ellie also sat back up and rose to his feet before saying, "I'll be back as soon as I'm physically recovered." The boys stayed together, sharing a meal before Ellie returned the way that he had come. He could hardly sleep that night, or the next, or really any other night that he spent in his own home. It seemed somehow distasteful compared to the vast expanse of darkness that he spent his time exploring. In this way, the boys went adventuring down in this underworld every couple of days, or as often as they could manage. This went on for some months before anything truly interesting was found. While they had acquired relics, built a camp, and even spent several consecutive days without returning home, although time didn't matter much down there or on the surface of Planet Zero for that matter, this place simply served as a more visceral version of the VR pastime games that the boys were well versed in. All of that changed when they found the time capsule. "Phil, look at that," Ellie said, pointing to an oddly square shape amongst some other rubble, sitting on a badly damaged slab of concrete. "What is it?" asked Phil rhetorically. Ellie rambled back. "It's like a crate or an ark or altar or something." After a few moments of carefully walking over to it, they arrived, in awe at the thing. It was indeed a large stone box. But as the boys got closer, they became even more amazed at it, because there were words inscribed on the lid of the stone crate. These were indeed the first words that the boys had seen in this underworld. Despite the thick layer of dust, which was removed with some difficulty, the inscription was still legible. To the Overworlders, Ellie excitedly read. I guess that's us? Phil asked back. Ellie continued. We are being slain as I write this. Judgment has come, and we have been found guilty. We will all die, and those who have ascended will live on. I do not know what hell is reserved for you, Overworlders, for surely you are more evil than we. But if any of you manage to venture back to this place with good intentions, then please consider this offering as an oasis healer and a peace offering from your servants below. I have collected the things which are most beneficial in this world and stored them for you to take, and restore order and peace for all men. What the? Ellie said after finishing reading. Was this guy crazy? Overworlders? Judgment? Peace offering? Let's open it, Phil said with unabashed excitement. It took some time for the boys to figure out how to break the seal, and then even more time to muscle off the heavy lid, but they managed it. Stale air left the surprisingly clean interior of the stone box. Everything inside was kept or wrapped in some preservative material. Books, mostly, filled the crate. Artwork, weapons, and some pieces of technology occupied the rest of space. The boys sorted through the items, not understanding what the weapons were, nor seeing the beauty in many of the art pieces. The books were by far the most interesting part to the boys. More words, Phil said, opening one of the odd things. For books didn't exist on Planet Zero anymore, at least in this format. Philosophy, history, and many forms of art were long-forgotten concepts. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? Ellie read from the book he picked up. God? Heaven? Earth? What? He said with confusion, as the words had long ago lost meaning. It took some time, but the boys collected the books and brought them all back to the ladder. There was a collection of philosophy books, some sort of set, as each was labeled the same, and had a number assigned to each volume. There were several books labeled Bible or Holy Book. Other books seemed to be just list words and definitions, while yet another series of books labeled Encyclopedia explained words and concepts in more detail. Each one of these books enthralled the boys to no end. The boys had pretty much stopped adventuring and gradually transported the books to their own homes, reading them around the clock. It was several months of study before they really began to understand the foreign concepts, and many of the books remained extremely confusing to the boys. While the boys didn't mind reading to themselves in their homes, most of the deep discussion of topics happened in person, and they would still sometimes go down to the pit and discuss things in more detail in their underworld camp, now comfortable with staying for several days, or so long as their supplies lasted. The underworld somehow made them feel more at home than their own houses, and the starkness of this quote-unquote overworld did. Government, philosophy, spirituality? We have no concept of things in our society. We don't even have a concept of society, Phil said one day, as they were relaxing in their camp. I know, Ellie replied, but these books seem to speak literally of a world where these concepts did exist. I think that world is here, where we are now, this place that has been destroyed. What do we do about it? Asked Phil. Doesn't it seem right for spirituality and government, love, all of these things to exist? I think so, Ellie replied, but it seems as if Planet Zero has forgotten all about it. How are we supposed to reintroduce these things when we don't even have a society to reintroduce it to? The discussion continued likewise on that day, but it was some time before any good ideas developed. Phil studied Sir Thomas Hobbes' work more thoroughly than the others, finding the concept of morality and societal structure enthralling, as well as the fact that Hobbes referenced the Bible so often. There surely was something special about that book. Phil gradually realized that Hobbes' entire work and the works of several other authors stemmed in some way from the Bible. Ellie, on the other hand, found the more fundamental works more compelling. He took some time to read all that he could from Plato and others, and even was able to find some commentary of the most complicated texts in that collection. What if we created society from the loose relationships that people form in pastime games, suggested Phil one day at the camp. It had been about a year from the time when they had first discovered the books, and in that time each of the boys grew a deep conviction that something was wrong with Planet Zero. We could, maybe, but we need some structure for that, Ellie said. Maybe a new pastime game, which encouraged people to form societies and governments? I was thinking the same thing, but it would be so different from what we have today. We'd have to build it entirely from the ground up, replied Phil, as the idea began to excite him. Ellie smiled back, saying, Exactly. Something new and different might be enough to get everyone to play, and then everyone could be part of developing the societies, and therefore part of them. The idea developed immensely from there, and the boys set out to develop the game. It only took the boys a couple of months to development before the game entered the beta stage, due to the fantastic tools available to game developers. Pastime verifiers, people who had the real job of approving or rejecting pastime activities, were able to play the game at that point. It made quite a stir in the group, and the game would have been rejected outright if played by individual users only. After all, the game did allow for violence between players and had a competitive nature and scoring system. It also allowed players to design their own realms with their own rules for social structures and tools for organization. All of these things were against the rules, normally, for pastime games in some form or another. However, the verifiers played collectively on the same realm and server. They created systems and growth and economies. They played with concepts and structures that they had never known could exist before. They worked together and grew friendships with each other. Before they made the final decision on the game's validity, the group discussed their opinions with each other. It's not encouraging or directly participating in violence. It's not encouraging or requiring competition, at least not the kind where there are true winners and losers. It's not even allowing people to really make their own games or goals. It simply allows the goals to be modified a little within each server. These were the sorts of reasons and counter-arguments that the verifiers gave to each other in order to justify the full release of the game. Because the game was so different from others and allowed players to develop new personal and interpersonal skills that they never really knew existed, the game's popularity swept over Planet Zero like an epidemic. After several months of play, the game had been standardized into two forms. One realm of the game valued players who created efficient and effective societal rules and political structures. In this format, the players gained the most points for developing and participating in cities which had structures that could handle all sorts of crimes and judge fairly between players' infractions. The other popular realm of the game valued players who were servants to their own societies and cities. The highest scoring players were those who studied their work of public service and effectively grew their society, encouraging morality in themselves and in others. In both forms of the game, there were many non-player characters intermixed, such that it was difficult to tell between players and non-players without researching outside of the game. These non-player characters created interesting and difficult situations constantly for players to participate in, and were constantly being upgraded and improved by the game developers. It was in no small part due to the original two developers of the game that these were the two main formats of the game. As time passed, the game's scoreboards showed players who had developed aptitudes in judging in the first realm and legislating and being able to be an effective public servant in the other realm. These high-scoring groups of players regularly met with one another, growing true friendships and communities amongst themselves, as did the various other groups of players who played towards different goals. Yet it was these two groups in particular who were considered the best at the game. It was those exact groups and the two original game developers who were chosen to the highest honor of Planet Zero, colonizing other planets. The game had effectively selected the players who would be best suited to perform in the revered space program, and every player recognized that the selected people were well suited to the task. The same day that the selection message went out, Ellie went to Phil's house to talk with him, presumably for the last time, as it was very likely that they would be separated by light years after they left Planet Zero. "Did we do anything?" asked Ellie. "I don't know, but I think so," Phil replied. "People think about more now. They have friends and even communities sometimes. And they go towards common goals within our game." "I know, but it's just a game, right? What about the real world? What about our government here? What about improving the lives of people on Planet Zero? What about that crazy message that we read on the crate years ago?" Ellie spouted off these questions before trailing off into a thoughtful silence. "Yeah, you're right. There's still more to do here. But I think we started something. We have real jobs now, and the most important jobs ever, in fact. We get to work on new societies, new governments, and new planets now," Phil said hopefully. "So that's it then. We just leave and never see each other again?" Ellie said, tearing up as the words came from his mouth. Phil embraced Ellie, a gesture that they had only read about before. It felt comforting. It felt calming. It brought peace. The two men spent the rest of the day with each other, eating together, laughing together, and crying together. Then Ellie went home for the last time. One more sleepless night passed for Ellie, while Phil managed to sleep in peace. The next day, the boys were transported to the space program facility. The domes of the transports were opaque as soon as the boys went in, and as the location was a secret. When they arrived, amongst the crowd of other colonists, they were directed by various robots and signs to their seats on the mini spacecraft which were launching today. It was a simple enough process. They were told that more instructions would arrive as they were needed, and that the colonizing educational materials and more flight information would be provided in transit. Ellie and Phil boarded their respective shuttles. It was nearly as exhilarating as the day when they first ventured into the underworld, yet it somehow seemed less real, less visceral, almost entirely fake. The shuttles launched, and several of the passengers passed out from the lift-off forces applied to their bodies. Huge amounts of shaking, loud noises, and general chaos seemed to ensue during the launch. Then there was near silence. As their ears adjusted, the uneasy breathing of the other passengers could be heard. 20 minutes had passed, and several people on either flight were starting to become worried. Where was the leader? What were the instructions? What about the colonizing education? As the murmuring grew, the passengers' seatbelts were loosed and retracted automatically back into the seats. Complaining turned to confusion, but it didn't last long, as a louder sound occurred, a sort of squealing, a breaking. Air seemed to be growing thinner. Large doors opened on the sides of each of the spacecraft, sucking all passengers, everyone who had been recruited for the colonization program, out into space. Ellie panicked, trying and flailing to grab a hold of something before being flung out into space. He felt his lungs collapse, an intense cold, and soon nothing. Phil felt fear, and yet did not panic. Instead, he turned his focus to the stars in awe of the vast expanses that nobody on Planet Zero could observe. He cried out to God, as the characters in the Bible had, "God, please save me." His mouth moved as his body floated away into nothingness. Epilogue. While I fully acknowledge that my analysis of the assigned text this week was particularly lacking in comparison to the past two sessions, that is at least partially intentional, as I approached this session with the intention to show some variety in what is possible in these monologues. I believe that the freedom allowed here can create greater things than we could if we were limited to following a particular structure or guidelines. I do want to point out a couple things about the story and the text as well, which may not have been evident, although I still wanted to point them out. Just in conclusion, it should be pointed out that Hobbes and Plato both, and I would say particularly Hobbes, have written to depths which are deserving of more time and an in-depth study, such that I don't think that no matter how I did this monologue, I could have really broached. I figured this out while entering the third section of Leviathan, and just decided I couldn't really do justice to the whole thing. Part of that's just me not understanding the text or the person well enough, and the breadth of the topics were also pretty broad. So I decided to boil Hobbes down to something like the making of good judges, and Platonic thought down to something like the making of good politicians. And this was an intentional decision to limit the scope of the monologue down to these subsections. With that in mind, I started evaluating fictional settings where I could elaborate and illustrate this. I came up with about 7 ideas, and I pitched them to Sarah, and she picked this one. So that was it. Here we are. This setting does provide some additional meaning that might be overlooked just from reading through it cursorily. I will say that what is a government without good politicians or good judges? It should be evident that we are dealing with a dystopian society in our story. And the point is that the society that we see in this story could occur when there are no good judges or no good politicians, or very few at least. I have a significant part of the backstory and future story worked out for this, and I realize that this story ends on something of a cliffhanger, but let's maybe talk more about that later and move on through the book club session onto the critical thinking questions, if we could.
"31 minutes and 54 seconds.
It did not feel that long, Jacob. That was.
I thought 30 was about what it would be. You were enthralled, Brandon.
That was amazing. I dearly hope you develop this universe and take it to the bank, because you've got something.
I hope you don't.
Yeah.
I hope you just finalize your short story.
Yeah, there's definitely both ways I could go with it. Just having read the stories just now, I feel like it needs there's like a lot of problems, and it's kind of fun because as a writer I can like make a list of things to fix and then make it better, and I'm gonna enjoy that process. But anyways, back to the book club. If we could, would anyone like to volunteer to ask their critical thinking question this week?
I will. So I wrote it down. The question was, to what extent does the sovereignty of a disparate group of individuals help or hinder a commonwealth? And if I may give some background thoughts to this question, please. The background thoughts are that I see in the modern world this lack of knowledge of the common good, lack of knowledge of what is good for society at large, intense selfishness and ambition, and amazing pride of individual humans, instead of the submission of the individual to the state or to anything in particular. So you probably know exactly how I feel about it.
I'm sorry, Brandon, could you do me a favor and please repeat that question?
Absolutely. Question was, to what extent does the sovereignty of a disparate group of individuals help or hinder a commonwealth, as opposed to the sovereignty of one person or a limited group of people?
I guess I want to start to answer that, and I'll make this really short because I think it's an answer that's been well documented and discussed elsewhere. The pros and cons of having a group is that you have more opinions, more thoughts, and it's more likely to be representative of a wider group, especially if the group was chosen well. The cons are that they might disagree and never get anything done. They might disagree and go to war with one another.
State of nature.
And like there's some other like obvious implications, but it's all kind of based on those two pros and cons, I think.
Yeah.
I could perhaps venture a different answer. I would say, well, first, one more time, if you would,
Sure.
state your question.
To what extent does the sovereignty of a disparate meaning completely unconnected, and everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, to what extent does a disparate group of individuals help or hinder a commonwealth? Very packed question. There's a lot there.
So yeah, it's about the sovereignty being placed in the masses, even if the masses are not connected.
Any way connected. Correct.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. And that's not a negative. It's just a statement of a fact. It's a complicated question.
Of course.
If there was a pooling of the persons, if there was some connection, which you've said there isn't, if there was some connection, then I would say that the advantage that's offered by the sovereignty of the group is hope. I would actually argue that there is hope when there's sovereignty in the group versus when there is only sovereignty in an individual. And when there's only sovereignty in an individual, I would argue there is no hope. And to support that, I would say people are flawed. They have virtues and vices, or virtues and sins. And if one person is the sovereign over others, then you have guaranteed that you will have the vices, the sins of that person manifested over the others. However, if you have sovereignty in a desperate group of people, if they're not desperate, you have the potential. That's why I say hope, is you have the potential of pooling the virtues and minimizing the vices. There's the hope, there's the potential to get the good and minimize the bad. But if there's just the one person, you have all the good and all the bad. So I say there's hope when there's many. But you said wholly desperate from each other, meaning there's no connection, which I would say there is no advantage for a commonwealth if the members of the commonwealth are wholly desperate. But I would argue that that's a flawed question, because if they are wholly desperate, they are not a commonwealth. Therefore, the question is mute. But sure, mute.
I think we're getting pretty close to that, though, in our particular era, and the current political climate, I think, would evidence that. So it was mainly based upon current problems in society.
Would you like to pose a response, Jonathan?
Sure. I do feel slightly disconnected without having this camera, so I hope that my thoughts and whatnot, opinions can come through pretty well.
We shall imagine your emphasis.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's an interesting question Brandon puts out. I went ahead and pulled out the dictionary. Before I get to that, this is my second meeting in the club, I believe. I don't think we met in August, and we met in September. I missed the meeting in October, which was the weekend of Stephen's celebration, etc. But if you do recall, at the meeting in September, I asked and proposed, I had a couple of things. I don't remember exactly what my first point was, but I believe my second point, kind of a generalized question that I asked was, how much are we going to try to maybe distinguish between quote unquote philosophy and quote unquote politics in this club. And it was more of just a thought experiment kind of a question, and we didn't necessarily make a real big, we didn't address it in a really distinct way, which I thought was fine. But I wanted to bring that question up so that it would be in the background. Obviously, to move into Socrates in this particular book, written by Plato. Am I coming through all right? I can't tell if I kind of hear a weird echo on my voice or something. This particular book with Plato, and then of course the book with Hobbes, government and politics starts to really take a really important role. And it's a bit of a clash and perhaps questions about what I might call trade-off between philosophy of one single person and then philosophies of groups. Brandon asks the question on this point. And his question is, like a concrete example of how do we resolve personal, individual philosophy that guides a person, or their lack of philosophy that guides them, with bigger group ideas, and how to come together in unity or not come together in some kind of unity. I'm going to pull out the dictionary here and just run through a really quick but I think important definition of what we have. Disparate is, of course, an adjective, and it comes out of Latin disparatus, which comes out of disparare, to separate, from dis, of course, meaning down and away from or separated, and parare, which means prepare. So the definition here is pretty simple. Markedly distinct in quality or character. Number 2, containing or made up of fundamentally different and often incongruous elements. I like that word incongruous a lot, because incongruous is just about the opposite end of the spectrum you can get from Commonwealth.
Yep.
And so his question here of what extent does the sovereignty of disparate people help or hinder establishment of a Commonwealth? I'm not even going to take the time to get the dictionary definition of Commonwealth, but I think it's, approximately and roughly pretty evident. It's locked into the word right there. It's a commonwealth. It's a common understanding, sharing. It's a commonality, which is not exactly the same thing as unity, of course, but it might be more powerful in some ways. So to what extent, that's a huge, introduction to say, my simple answer to his question of what extent is sovereignty of disparate people, I'm not exactly sure maybe what he's trying to say with sovereignty, but I'm just going to do a quick substitution and sort of change his question. I'm just going to say, to what extent does the existence of disparate people, quote unquote, in a local area help or hinder the establishment of that Commonwealth? I think it's impossible. I don't think they can coexist. I don't think it's compatible that disparate people will form a Commonwealth. That's the short answer. I could probably riff and go off of that idea for a lot longer, but I think that's all I need to say.
Yay, nationalism.
Very interesting.
Thank you for that answer, Jonathan. That was actually very in keeping with the spirit of the question. Thank you.
It was a really nice question. Brandon, do you want to take any time to
I think Jacob
define or solidify anything what you mean with that word sovereignty? I'm just curious if you have anything specific that you're trying to say with the word sovereignty.
With Jacob's permission, as he is currently the sovereign of the meeting.
Look at that long drink of tea. Or whatever.
Yeah, Brandon, I would love to hear your responses.
Okay. I guess I'll just start with Jonathan's. To Jonathan's, I I'll explain what I meant by sovereignty. What really spurred this question is actually a discussion with Stephen. I was trying to work out the thoughts, and he mentioned the presupposition in American culture that everybody has is that all of us are in charge of where this country goes. Is that a accurate?
Quite.
Okay. So then when that's your presupposition that everyone is in charge of where the country goes, the problem you run into is what exactly you defined. And thank you for giving such a definition of the word disparate.
Yes.
Because everybody has their own ends. Everybody's doing what is right in their own eyes. We don't have some of the things that used to unify us. Race no longer unifies us. We do not really share a common language or culture anymore. That is a national killer, some would say. Nor do we share the same religion anymore. So then the question that happens is, what happens to this foot of iron mixed together? Is it doomed entirely? And I think that is where Stephen's answer really comes in, is that with proper direction, there is a way to pool the virtues of the people. And I think that is just a profound idea, and the one that I choose to hold on to, because I see exactly what Jonathan is saying, and I've thought that for most of my life, since the year 2008, which is what has kept me from politics for such a long amount of time, is that I see no hope of anything being fixed. I see no hope of things being made right, and see politics as a vain pursuit. But because of what Stephen has said, I see there a hope of the virtues being pooled in such a way as the vices are downplayed. And then to what Jacob said, there are pros and cons. I mean, there really are. To some extent, there will be failings of the people. And that really led into what Stephen said very well as well, that you have to figure out a way to play to the virtues of the people more than the vices. So yeah, thank you for your answers, gentlemen. That was
If I can approach Jacob and go ahead and ask for an additional sub-question to go underneath this one.
Sure.
Stephen, I really want to give the strongest example or the strongest definition of what you were just talking about. So really, please correct me, or even maybe go ahead and repeat what you were just saying, what your answer was to Jacob's question. I was writing more what his question was, and writing a couple ideas of my own, so I didn't get your response written down. But I have a single line here of virtues are pooled and vices are restricted. Could you just expound on that really quickly?
Sure. And I will say that the smallest and most obvious example of what I was trying to say is found in marriage. What I mean by that is the strengths and the weaknesses, or the virtues and the vices. Although vices, in my mind, in this circumstance, is more of just sins. Marriage, which is nothing more than entering into communion with each other, two people entering into community with each other in a very intense way, leads to, in my opinion, either the multiplication of the virtues or the multiplication of the vices. People get better or they get worse, and the reason is because being in community forces people to face the reality of who they are and who others are, and then they have to decide what to do once they've seen the reality of who they are and who others are. Without community, you don't have to face the reality of who you are or who other people are. When you're in community, you have to face the reality of who you are and who other people are. And if you find out that there's parts of you that are bad, that are evil, that are not what you would want, you have to decide how to react. And if you find out that there are parts of another person that are bad, that are evil, that are not what you would expect or hope for, you likewise... Lolo! Sorry. Lolo! Hey! I'm so sorry.
This is really good.
I'm gonna see if she stops. This is more long-winded than I wanted it to be.
Okay, but that's fine. I think that's a fine example. I was also just wondering if you could kind of cross over to the other side. You were talking about if there's roughly the idea was something like if there's one person in charge, then that one person in charge, that person's
Hold on 1
virtue.
second, Jonathan.
Sure.
Hold on to that thought 1 second. He had to walk off to
Okay.
stop the thought.
Michelle's back.
Oh. Alright, so that's why Lolo's going mad.
Yeah.
No, I'm
The
receiving
women
texts
were at
about
the
this.
door.
Oh, okay.
Close this door. Okay. So what did
Just
you want
to
from me?
cross over to another side of what you were talking about, Stephen, you were talking something about, or you kind of mentioned in passing something about if there's a single person in charge, then that person's virtues maybe, but definitely vices are going to be amplified across the whole group. Did you say something like that?
Well, if you only have one person in which all the sovereignty is located, then you guarantee that all of that person will be made manifest.
Okay. So,
So
the
maybe
reason I'm particularly
But it's just made obvious.
the reason I'm particularly pulling that out is I hope that this works as sort of a question that we can all work off of. But I'm thinking of Gorgias. I don't remember exactly which line this is, but I think this is somewhere in this second speaker, and it's with Apellus. And Socrates makes some kind of claim that the dictator in society is the least powerful member. Does anybody remember that passage?
I think I know what you're saying. I think I remember what you're saying.
Do you remember that passage, Jacob?
You said Socrates made that claim?
Yes. I'm almost 100% sure that Socrates makes that claim.
Yeah, it
And then he
sounds
goes on-
plausible. I don't remember the line.
You don't remember that itself? Okay, anyhow, the only reason I bring that up is he goes on to expound on this and try to prove that the dictator never gets to do what he wants, and that instead he's in this tricky position where he's caught between doing what he wants and doing what is best for himself and whatnot. And so it's interesting to think of Stephen's response with, if there's this one person who is leading and simultaneously kind of giving and enforcing the morals, shall we say, for this whole disparate group, that person is going to be amplified or manifested in the virtues and in the vices. And I'm just wondering if that has anything to do with or has any connection with Socrates' claim that that dictator is actually the least powerful member of society.
I would be inclined to say that the point you bring up is wonderful, and that they agree with one another, because when this sovereignty is over the group is sovereign. Like I said, you have the opportunity to draw forward the virtues and draw back the vices, and it's because of the equal playing field in the interaction. But if you have a sovereign who is sovereign overall,
right,
that person doesn't get to be purified by equals. They just get to be used as what and who they are. They don't have as much of an opportunity to pull from other people's strengths and to give their weaknesses to others.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Well, I bring it up because I thought it was an amazing claim of Socrates, and I don't even know if it's necessarily true. I don't know if I agree with it.
Amazing claim. Many amazing claims.
It all matters on perspective, I think. And perhaps with more context, it might make more sense.
Yeah, well, I wish I could. I'm at a really serious disadvantage to this whole thing because I had these books in physical format from my library, and I returned them on Wednesday or Thursday of this week, so I don't have the books here in front of me, unfortunately. But I was wondering if that particular thing stood out to anybody or if anyone remembered that claim. when Socrates is starting to move away from the rhetoric side of his talk, and he's going more into morality, and I believe he's talking with Polus, and they're talking about who's powerful and who's not and whatnot. So anyhow, but I think I agreed with Stephen's response to Jacob's question.
All very interesting. More critical thinking questions.
You go ahead, Stephen, because I'm kind of formatting mine.
Okay. Mine's not overly well formatted either, but in Gorgias, the first question that's wrestled with is rhetoric and defining it, and then in defining it, trying to discover its function and worth. And of course, they have a really hard time with defining rhetoric and discovering its function and worth. My critical thought question has to do with rhetoric in particular, and okay, I'll just make it as simple as possible.
Certainly.
Could we do without rhetoric in community? And if we could, what would that look like?
I'm going to step away for just 5 minutes, and I'll be right back. So if you all want to go ahead, don't wait on me or anything like that.
5 minutes?
2 minutes. Fine. I'll be right back.
Okay.
As a fan of rhetoric, I think I need to go ahead and address this.
Address this, he says.
With rhetorical emphasis. As a fan of rhetoric, indeed, I must dissent and state that rhetoric is necessary part of language. Now, I can't at this time go into a Platonic discourse about why that might be, especially considering Gorgias and the difficulty that they had and how it was everyone had their own definition. And what I saw happen is that Socrates just kind of, spat on everyone's definitions and then they moved on. They didn't really get to a conclusion on that point, and that's a common thing in Plato. So, ignoring all that, I'll make a simple definition, a working definition, and one that is ridiculously unfair towards my point of view, is that, to be clear, rhetoric is a flourish in language that, from a definitional standpoint, is intrinsically unnecessary, but from an interpersonal communication standpoint, is intrinsically important. There's nothing. So, rhetoric is the component of language that I use in order to communicate more effectively to individuals.
So, according to your definition, rhetoric is unnecessary. True or false?
True.
And according to your definition, rhetoric is important. True or false?
Also true.
Okay. So that relates to my question. Is rhetoric necessary?
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm back.
I wanna.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jacob has just defined rhetoric.
Oh, great. So good. I'm sorry. Could you repeat
I
that?
did what Plato could not.
Let's drink to that.
So my question was: is rhetoric
Lol.
can we do without rhetoric?
Can we do without rhetoric in the community, I believe, is what you specifically
Yes.
said.
Yeah.
Jacob's definition of rhetoric now.
Excellent. Could you please define it again, Mr. Jacob?
Okay, so it's the component of language that allows me to communicate more effectively to individuals. So if I was speaking to a group, I like a completely random and disparate group with no sociocultural background, with no, like, abstractly speaking, then I would use no rhetoric and be optimal. However, between each individual, the rhetoric flair on my language allows for more effective communication to each individual according to my understanding of them. It's a
Okay, and
it's a
just a clarification.
utilitarian definition.
Just changed your entire definition.
Wait, really?
Okay, so just a clarification. Is this your specific definition, Jacob, or did you pull this out of a book?
No, this is an arbitrary definition I just made up for no reason.
Ah, okay. So rhetoric is the part of speech used to communicate individual to individual, something like this.
To
What he
bring
said
more meaning
first
towards each
was so
individual.
much more wonderful. What he said first was so much. Okay, what Jacob said first was that it was unnecessary. It was the part of communication that's unnecessary but very important.
Very effective but unnecessary.
He said unnecessary but important.
We can go with
So
that.
I'm trying to figure out if it's unnecessary and important, can we do without it? Which was my first question. Like, if it's unnecessary, it makes it sound like we can do without it. But if it's important,
Well,
does that
what are you
change?
necessitating? I mean, this is... If you want to go down this rhetorical trail, then we can.
You didn't answer my question. You were Polis. Or Polis, whatever.
I'm a bit fried from all the writing and reading I've done, so... Moving on to someone else's answer, yes.
All right. Having read a little bit of Aristotle's rhetoric, Aristotle defines the skill in rhetoric as the ability to find the means of persuasion available to one in any given situation. So therefore, if you want to get a people group to do anything without the presence of the Holy Spirit, one must avail themselves of the tools of rhetoric. Therefore, that means rhetoric is integral and entirely necessary in the tools of politics, because if we believe in the separation of church and state, then you're not going to be availing yourself of the third person of the Trinity to carry the people to do something for you. Rather, you might pray before your speech, but you get up and give a speech and say, here is why I think we should invade Iraq. Or something like that. So in a political community, I think rhetoric is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, there's no way to stir up great amounts of people to do things. You could even make the argument that in the bounds of the church, rhetoric might be necessary, but it's a different kind of rhetoric. It's not means of persuasion, maybe. There's maybe something more to it. You're stirring up one another to leaven good works. So there is a stirring up that happens in a political sense and in a spiritual sense. In an individual sense, you stir up people to do things, and you can use that tool for the benefit of the person you're speaking to, or you could use that tool for your own benefit, selfishly. And I think that is ultimately the point of Gorgias, that's the problem, is using that tool to cause harm to other people. So yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say on that.
Stephen, you do me an enormous favor, and please repeat your question one more time. I just need to write it down.
Is rhetoric necessary in community?
That's not exactly how you said it the first time, but that's okay.
I think
It's shorter now.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
I've got the question if you want to hear it word for word. I mean,
You're right.
I thought it was something like, can we do without?
yeah, could we do without rhetoric in community? And if we could, what would that look like?
Yeah, no one's even tried that.
Because I don't think it's possible. So
So I'm going to actually use your original version of the question a little more, Stephen.
Yes, okay, that's good.
So I'm going to repeat this back one more time. Is it my turn to speak? Am I speaking out of turn?
It is your turn.
Oh, no. Can we do without rhetoric in the community? And then a follow-up maybe. If so, how? And that is Mr. Stevens' question. My short answer is again, no. No, we cannot do without rhetoric in the community.
I think we all agree then.
No one's even trying.
Oh, do I need to expound on that or just leave it be?
You have disparate groups of individuals who
Well-
are not doing the same thing if you don't stir them up somehow.
Honestly, Stephen, I'm a bit taken back by the question. Like, maybe the what could it look like would allow for some explanation, but rhetoric is such an intrinsic part of communication. So you're asking, what would communication look like without rhetoric? And it's like, I don't know, yeah, binary computer terms or something. I don't know. Like AI talking to one another. But that probably uses rhetoric too. So
Okay, well, I have an underlying thought if y'all want to know it.
Certainly.
I think let's get to that. Yeah.
Rhetoric is words. Rhetoric seems to me to be about persuasion. And persuasion seems to be what's necessary in community. However, persuasion, I do not believe, is restricted to just being achieved by words. I believe you can persuade with, for instance, actions.
Oh, yes.
And I would argue
Yes, you can.
that there are cultures in the world, and particularly thinking about the Chinese culture, because I've been doing a lot of ancient Chinese history study recently, that they were very rarely persuasive speakers. Everything was about action. And their greatest leaders usually never even spoke to the people. And yet they were the sovereigns of a community and they didn't use rhetoric. It's very different.
Well, then there's the belief that they're probably a god, so you just do what they say or die. So
Well, their actions were more persuasive than their words. In fact, they didn't use their words to persuade, they used their actions to persuade. So is rhetoric necessary?
but they're a
Community.
god. They don't need to. But when we're all human beings in the Western
Wouldn't
world,
rhetoric be an underlying fact in their society structure?
Explain.
Well, like Brandon brought up, if the ruler is considered a god, that's kind of a rhetorical teaching. So it's ingrained in them. Maybe not. I
would agree with that point, and I can expound on that. But I would agree with that basic premise.
You could expound.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so if I expound on that, and I can go back and also maybe answer more than what my very blunt and direct answer was to your first question. But to continue on with Jacob's idea, from what I understand, Stephen is proposing some idea of there is a society with the leader who is considered divine, and therefore he is persuasive.
I had no divinity in mind in my situation. That was added after.
Okay, so it's not.
And he's,
Okay, so let's assume the contrary. Let's assume that he's not divine. Okay, no problem. Let's assume that he's not divine. The leader is not divine in society, but he is persuasive because of his actions. Is that right?
True.
Okay. What kind of action is he taking? And my end result of that question of what kind of action is he taking is, I would say, I think it's going to always conclude in violence.
That is a better answer.
It's going to conclude in violence. Because, I would agree in this particular case with the maxim, policy is made at the end of the rifle. And so, if we're going to go with the idea that, just to change paradigms really quickly, if we're going to go with the idea that the leader is divine, that must be taught. Anyone can claim to be divine, but you try to look for authority to go with that. And so if the people are taught that this leader is divine, that teaching is going to be using rhetoric. Because otherwise, there's no differentiation between the leader and a thug. Is there? Not that I can tell. And so, quote unquote, emperor so and so can start running around the countryside claiming, I am a leader. He may not even need to claim his divinity. I am a leader, listen to me, and do what I do, or do as I'm persuading you to do.
Let me get that again. You said the leader is tacitly declaring, I'm a leader. Listen
No, it doesn't have to be tacit. It can be, explicit.
Ah.
Because the leader's, unless he's born into this leadership position, right, he's going to have to build up his leadership position. Is that understood? I'm talking about the very first one. Whoever the first guy is to try to take leadership. He's going to have to build up his leadership position. So is he going to do that with words or with acts?
Your signal is suffering. We've gotten about 50% of the last
It's
minute.
actually yours, Steven.
Oh, it was us?
Yeah, I saw the yellow sign.
Interesting. Okay.
So could I conclude from what you're saying that using rhetoric prevents people from using violence to achieve their ends?
No. No. I don't think that would be an appropriate conclusion at all. But I will say that I don't think it's possible to have any community direction without rhetoric.
He said no, but he doesn't think there's a community direction without rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Would you scoot over a little bit?
Sorry. Okay, no community direction.
Are you guys trying to reset the signal a little bit or something? I don't know if I should try to talk or not talk.
Yeah, they keep freezing.
Yeah, I know. I see that.
I'm working on it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you?
Yeah, you're coming in real time and loud, so good.
Good. Okay, so to conclude, you said no community direction without rhetoric. Is that the main point of what you said? I'm sorry, we didn't get much of it.
Yeah, no. I think that my intermediary steps were maybe not totally necessary, but yes, I think that's a good starting point at least. I'm not going to say that's a rule, but I think that's a good starting point. Let me go back and even more generally try to answer this question. Stephen comes out with a question of, can we do without rhetoric in the community? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the question. Can we do without rhetoric in the community? And my immediate response, it's like this gut instinct whenever I'm in here in this club, is, well, what do you mean by rhetoric and how are we going to define that? But let's just kind of roughly use Socrates' definition for rhetoric at the beginning of the book of Gorgias. Socrates roughly says, I don't think rhetoric is any kind of expertise or specialized field at all. I think it's just a knack. Does anyone remember that?
Yes.
In my particular translation, it was done as knack.
Yep.
It's a knack like cookery or ornamentation. I think this is very disingenuous. I'm not really convinced by this definition because the entire time, Socrates later goes back, well, not the entire time. Let me clarify that again. Socrates later goes on and he's talking about the difference between appealing to a huge group of people to verify your truth or simply trying to convince your opponent. And Socrates later convinces, I think it's Polus. I don't think he ever specifically convinces Gorgias, but he's convincing Polus of some point, and he gets Polus to concede a point. How can Socrates himself do that without rhetoric? And so if Socrates wants to stand there and say, I think that rhetoric is just a knack, well, then he needs to be ready to be put under the exact same magnifying glass. And any way that Socrates talks may be just a knack. I don't find this definition very complete.
That's good.
I'll kind of maybe try and round this question out, or at least say a couple things and then ask Stephen to talk again. I don't think Socrates was being genuine with that definition. I don't think that that's really what he believes. I think
Okay.
that Socrates within Plato, or Plato more specifically, does a lot of this devil's advocate style of argument
Okay.
in order to progress the plot line. He's doing a
Certainly.
series of questions and allowing the other person to do all of the leading. At least that's how it appears. Now, it's quite tricky and using an amazing amount of rhetoric, honestly, and other deceitful methods in order to do so. But yeah, to kind of move away from that, no, I don't think anyone's really arguing that it's just a knack. Apparently, the people in this story, that was a useful point or counterpoint for Socrates to make at the time. The other thing I wanted to say is I guess a more honest look at Stephen's question would reveal, or at least try and evaluate, the extent and definition of rhetoric. If it is something that's intrinsically tied to speech, if you do, I'd say, limit the definition in that way, then, we can imagine all sorts of societies without speech and therefore without rhetoric. Okay. I don't think that a community is strong without communication. And I think speech is pretty much the strongest communicator. With some caution, I say that, but in sort of a attempt to continue this, I would just maybe ask Stephen if he had any finishing thoughts on his question.
So obviously, I asked the question as an invitation to be disproved. Obviously, and
I'm
it's
not going to assume that, but okay.
invitation to be disproved. But I also asked it because I think that it's a good exercise in critical thinking to attempt to imagine a community without rhetoric, and the most concrete community where there was less rhetoric that I'm aware of was the Spartans. No, it was the first major empire of China, and I've really enjoyed reading about it. However, I'm looking at it from a historical point of view, a top-down point of view, and it's particularly from the point of view of the leaders and the leader and how they interacted with their people, and there didn't seem to be much of any strong rhetoric there, but that doesn't mean there wasn't rhetoric in the community. I think that the best way to disprove or to prove that rhetoric is
Necessary?
I want to back up a second. If rhetoric is attached to speech, then yeah, it introduces some flaws. Particularly because I believe that two people who don't speak the same language can become friends without learning the language that the other speaks.
And therefore community.
And have entered into a community. But there's not rhetoric if rhetoric is speech. That's my answer to that question. Is maybe it's not necessary. Because when you go down to the microcosm of two people, I believe they can be friends without rhetoric, and so that's like my way to disprove it.
That brings you back then to more definitions. Then you have to further define community, because in the community boundaries you just defined, it's perfectly not necessary.
Yeah.
But in certain boundaries of community, it might.
I think we all understand that this is somewhat dependent on our definitions, and maybe if I can repeat what I said originally, which was somewhat unintelligible, is just that no, it's not necessary, but it's really beneficial.
Now, yeah, that was my conclusion. My conclusion was I don't think a healthy community can exist without rhetoric. That was my conclusion.
Stephen, this is not very genuine of you. This is getting kind of disingenuous. Now all of
What?
a sudden you're putting a
Well, it's a
qualifier
critical
on
thinking
community.
question, so that's fine, right?
Well, that's fine, but I am saying he is all of a sudden putting a qualifier on community. We
Uh,
were hopefully setting up community as some kind of, summum bonum, like the ultimate good. And
uh-huh.
all of a sudden now we're going to make a quick definition of like, okay, well, we can have a community, but now we're also going to define this upper level of healthy community. And you can continue this.
That is a natural progression that
Nice.
if you consider the first question, you have to get to that point. I can see that.
What if I consider which first question?
Well, if you consider the first question, can we do without it? Then you will eventually get to the point of, but is it a healthy community? Because, like you said, violence is often, if not always, the main action that
Of
you
persuasion?
persuasion.
Mhm.
Now I know that there's various definitions around, but we all feel that we know what rhetoric means, okay? And based on the feeling of the word rhetoric,
Mhm.
we can come to agreements of a sort.
Sure. Okay.
So, like you have
Actually,
to
I
get
think that that's really unifying what you just said. So that brought Jonathan's statements into play, uh, as well as Brandon's, and I've repeated mine. So
okay.
I think that's really
Okay.
good.
I apologize if I'm sloppy. I haven't slept much.
No. I'm not even particularly saying you're incredibly sloppy or anything like that. I'm simply saying it's amazing because, well,
No, I'm not.
as I form my critical thinking question right now, yes, I am forming it right now. It's going to interplay with this. So I guess should we move on to that, to my point on that?
Yeah, I think we're ready for that.
For my question, okay. I don't know exactly how to make this into a question, so I'm going to make it kind of the simplest version of the question that I can. Moving away from some of the bigger overarching themes, maybe that we've talked about, or the way that we've talked about things like commonwealth, community, politics, etc., those kind of things. My question is a little bit more, shall we say, tactical. So moving down to a technique or a very deliberate way to work, how can we be good debaters or good conversationalists and watch out for specifically a technique? The only way I can think of phrasing this is bait and switch. What is a good way to, in various situations, are there multiple good ways to address a bait and switch of the person that you are having the conversation with? I guess I can back up really quickly while you're maybe forming your answer to that question. And it wasn't a great question necessarily, but the reason I bring it up is I believe this is the first time that we have, at least I have, directly read Socrates in this club. And I was rather underwhelmed, actually. That's okay. But I found Socrates sometimes disingenuous. And so, for example of that right here, if I was going to be very absolute about it, might be what Stephen has just come up with, where he brings out an idea of a community without rhetoric, and then acknowledging that it is possible, but then he wants to make a distinguishing to say, okay, we can have a healthy community now. And of course, we can understand that this process could be repeated ad infinitum, right? We could keep doing these quantifiers and qualifiers on whatever the word is that we want to use. The reason that this came up to my attention was because my particular translation had some really nice footnotes, some really nice critiques of different things. And they critiqued some of his arguments, and they were talking about that Socrates may have even started off from some faulty premises and therefore really got to some really erroneous conclusions pretty quickly. And so I'm thinking specifically about, and I don't have the books here in front of me, so I can't pull out a passage for you. I can't even really give you a line or something like that, but I'm thinking of a lot of his talking with Paulus and talking about the distinguishing between doing what one wants versus doing what is best for oneself and things like this. And the footnote that I happened to see was someone was saying there is a change in there that's very subtle but very important, where Socrates he continues to use this word good, but instead of talking about what's good for the individual, he's now talking about what's good from the third party, from the third person perspective, from the more of the group setting, and what is good done to that person. And he's talking about justice and injustice and different things like this. So my question is, again, from a technique or a persuasive level, how can we be attentive and watch for bait and switch techniques where a definition or a starting definition is not carried through to the end of the argument, or definition changes midway through, or the examples don't line up with the starting point of thought?
You're basically asking, how can we effectively debate on MSNBC?
Whoa.
How can we best avoid the Socratic method?
How can
I
we...
don't know if I would use them necessarily, Brandon, but okay, yeah, that's fine.
No. There's definitely some panels that just cause problems.
I can start maybe. I haven't started yet.
You guys can take your time, and even I'm still sort of focused and thinking about what maybe this question can mean. But if you want to start, Stephen, go right ahead.
I can kind of start. I can tell from your question and the way you prepared us for your question that you have a certain distaste for Socrates' methods within Gorgias, and I do not disagree with you necessarily. And we are really focused on Gorgias here, not Leviathan, but that's okay. Leviathan was maybe a bit much for us to grasp enough to handle in this format. But anyway, with Gorgias, my impression when I read Gorgias, and I told Brandon this earlier and he laughed at me,
Because I thought it was funny.
I felt like I was reading the ancient version of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. I sincerely
Shame on you.
I sincerely felt that way because you use the word disingenuine. It's definitely there. There's definitely disingenuineness. There's definitely faulty premises that lead to erroneous conclusions, at least in my opinion. And Socrates doesn't take the time or effort to correct the faulty premises or the erroneous conclusions. And I could talk a long time about why the character of Socrates is not correcting that. But what's the point of Gorgias? In my mind, it was a political comedy. It was a political comedy, and that's why I akin it to Much Ado About Nothing.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I completely misunderstood you, and I thought you were saying that the Leviathan was the ancient version of
no.
Much Ado About Nothing.
Whoa.
I completely misunderstood you. Did you make a bait and switch there, sir? No? Okay.
Quite not.
I said that we weren't really discussing Leviathan, but maybe that's okay. We're discussing Gorgias.
That's fine. Okay.
It seems like the ancient version of Much Ado About Nothing to me because it's a political comedy, in my opinion, wherein the goal doesn't appear to be finding truth in the traditional sense. It more appears to be discovering the folly. That appears to be the point of Gorgias, which is like Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing for me. So like the bait and switch that happens and the disingenuousness that you mentioned, I feel like it's there because of the nature of the book, not necessarily the character of Socrates and how he prefers to operate. And your question, I didn't answer at all.
No, that's okay. It's a nice introductory statement.
Kind of, yeah, introductory statement. Do you want to restate your question now?
Just one moment. I'm finishing writing it up here.
Yeah, I think you're right, Stephen, in that the book is primarily about dismissing various follies that people have, specifically about being a politician. If you take a structured look at it, I think each character even represents a certain folly. But I will say I found a lot more moral from the story than perhaps others, especially towards the point where Socrates' contenders step out of the argument, and even in the last bit of that, I think that Socrates makes a strong point for the education, the growth of a politician, and just being morally upright and learning and earning your craft and position. And I think that was an important moral to make in that time. But back to Jonathan.
So my final formulated question here for all of the rest of you. Thank you so much for those comments, Jacob. I think I will continue on those or expound on those maybe in a moment. The question is, in the context of a debate or a conversation, what are tactics and techniques to perceive and address devious rhetoric, such as a bait and switch?
All right, I want to go ahead. That is extremely interesting, and I think that the Greeks and the Romans, and perhaps people after that, spent a ridiculous amount of time playing with that concept and just maybe not addressing it directly, but certainly addressing it from a subconscious approach. If you continue to read Plato, you will find that there's question and answer games, and maybe there's other historical figures who can state this more clearly, but the entire goal of these was to catch their opponent in an inconsistency, and the use of this deceitful rhetoric was well accepted and considered entertainment in those societies. So it's probably a really good question that you ask it, because I think there's a lot of historical precedent for
Sure.
considering it.
Well, I will bring up one more concrete example, maybe before anyone else puts in a point. But there was at one point where they were, in the very beginning, it was Socrates and Gorgias, and they were discussing rhetoric itself. And this was just about after Socrates describes it as a knack. So it's a type of flattery, which may or may not be genuine, as Jacob has brought up. And he is talking about morality, and Gorgias is sort of making the claim, or it's almost getting to the point where Gorgias is going to make a claim that a true rhetorician cannot act immorally, and Socrates wants to address that. And so there was one point where I thought this was just kind of unfair. I didn't agree with him. He was talking about, what do you call a person who understands music? And Gorgias responds, a musician. And what do you call someone who understands building? He says, a builder. So what do you call someone who understands morality? He says, well, a moral person. And I disagreed with Socrates on that point. I thought that was too simple. I thought that was too... It's really too simple. I mean, someone can understand music, but I would call a musician someone who creates music. You can understand building all day, but if you don't act as a builder, then you aren't a builder. You can understand morality all day long, but if you don't act morally, then you're not a moral person. Not exactly. I think that's a little too simple. So anyhow, I'm not going to say that's exactly a bait and a switch, but again, and I'm just kind of pounding on you, not trying to pound particularly on you, Stephen, but as I'm saying, I think this is just a quick example right here of, to me, it seems a little bit disingenuous because, and I made the assumption myself, if we're going to talk about rhetoric in the community, I thought that the community was our most good idea. And then at the end, you want to make a distinction and say, well, we can have a community, but we cannot have a healthy community. And so it's a bit of a bait and switch. You see kind of what I'm saying?
I do.
Okay. So that's kind of what I'm talking about that particular technique. You yourself are using rhetoric in that question, right?
Yes.
We're trying to find a common ground. We're trying to argue something out. So my question is, how do you perceive and address what I might call devious rhetoric, such as a bait and switch or other techniques.
May I?
Go ahead.
So, do we define bait and switch as the assertion of your argument in a sentence, maybe more than that, and then later on changing and claiming your argument was something else from what you stated earlier in the conversation? Is that what we define bait and switch as?
Yeah, that's a pretty good definition of bait and switch. I would say a bait and switch is exactly, or more precisely, it's getting your opponent to agree with you about a definition or a position or a sort of an axiom. And then going and changing, probably secretly, changing a part of that definition and changing to an axiom or a definition or something that your opponent has not agreed to, and using that change to go on to prove your point or move the conversation in a new direction, which does not follow from the first assumed position. So that's the bait and switch. It's a change of definition specifically after you get your opponent to concede, because that's what's going on specifically in Gorgias. Is this happens all the time. I notice all the time with the English translation. He would put something out there, and Socrates would ask something to Apellus or Gorgias, say, "Does this seem reasonable?" And then there's just a single line response of yes, or seems okay, or yeah, that seems right, or I suppose. And so you're getting an acquiescence, you're getting an agreement from your opponent, but you have to be careful, and the opponent should watch you so that you don't change that definition midway through your talk and take off in another rhetorical direction.
That's
really,
what
I would say.
That definition is really helpful as far as bait and switch is concerned. You know, I think back to all the talk shows I've listened to where I've heard this tactic used, and I think, what would I do if I was in that situation? And I think the best thing that I can think of right now, and there's probably a lot more, when a person makes a definitive statement of belief, maybe that's not the best way to say that, a definitive statement, that's all I'll say. When a person makes a definitive statement early on in the conversation, perhaps you have them repeat it to you. You then repeat it to them. Really cement that moment in the conversation. Intentionally try to slow the conversation down so that moment of defining is emphasized. And then later on, it makes it harder to achieve a bait and switch because you spent 2 minutes making them clarify and then repeating it back to them and seeing if they would agree to what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But that's a very cursory idea. There are probably deeper tactics than
might work.
Repeated.
Might work. You could also maybe have a scribe or somebody there documenting. Or you could have some kind of electronic recording, maybe. Something like that, if that's so necessary.
It's common, and I want to add to Brandon's, but I'll make a slightly different point as well. It's common to have a moderator in a debate, and I think historically that was the person who sort of prevented that sort of thing from happening. To add to Brandon's, though, there's a modern term called steel manning, which is the opposite of straw manning. It's where you restate your opponent's argument in a way that in the way that your opponent agrees with the statement. And that sort of technique assures that you understand what your opponent's position is. And when you combine that technique with a discussion goal, specifically you go forth before you've really delved into the topic and set forth a goal for the discussion or debate. So something that you want to define, something you want to agree on, something or concept that you want to develop to the nth degree. Those are examples of or maybe abstract examples of what goals can be. That's another way I think that you're just being genuine in your approach to discussion. And if you're genuine, if both characters are genuine, then the bait and switch just won't happen. Now, one other point, I think maybe to add to bait and switch in terms of dangerous rhetorical things, and I think this is more of what I saw in Socrates. Mm-hmm. Leading questions. I think Socrates is more guilty of leading questions than he is of bait and switch. Could be wrong.
Yeah.
Um,
I think I would agree with that. I don't know if exactly it's the exact same technique, but I was thinking begging the question.
yeah,
I don't know if that's the
the
same
same
thing,
thing.
right?
Same thing.
Begging the question or leading the question, trying to lead the witness, whatnot. There's a enormous amount of things of thinking. Of course, I was thinking of steel manning versus straw manning as I was working this question that which you brought about, which you brought to attention, Jacob. There's begging the question. There is guilt by association, might be another quick flourish that someone can pull out. Just do a quick association of, this go together, and so the fourth thing is guilty or something. But I would agree, yeah, steel manning is a really neat tactic. It's a really important thing, and so you can divide. I'm not trying to keep you from answering, Stephen, but I would just quickly say maybe you can divide the answer or classify the answers to my question in two different directions. People who argue in good faith and those who argue in bad faith. And that's again another phrase that we're familiar with in malafide or whatever the opposite of that is. So you're going to have people who are going to take the genuine and I would say benevolent attitude to you debating, and they're going to try to give you all of the best definitions and try to agree with you as you were talking about, Jacob. But then there are also people who are going to be more manipulative, and they're going to be more malevolent, and they're going to subvert, change definitions, and et cetera, et cetera. So anyhow, I would say that you can find the techniques and the tactics and the awareness, like I'm saying, to work with both sides of those things. With a person who's going to argue in good faith, you can maybe steel man. With a person who argues in bad faith, you're going to have to maybe constantly pull them back to the definitions and make sure that the ground underneath the debate is not moved, like Brandon was saying.
That's much more interesting, Jonathan, because I was definitely only trying to address the good faith people. My defense to bad faith people is to stop talking to them. And I think that that's the most common reaction in the modern day. Mostly because it's rare to get them to really believe anything. Thank you. So, yeah, I'm a blank for the other side of things. That's give me like 6 months or something, and I'll maybe develop a method.
Think about that, because that's an integral question to modern problems.
Yeah. Steven, I know you're chopping at the bit over there in the corner. Please go ahead.
What I want to say is drastically different than what the three of you have said.
Okay.
So there seems to be an assumption behind all of those answers. And that assumption is that when this rhetorical technique is done that involves the changing of the definitions after commonality has been established, there seems to be an assumption that that is something that is bad and should be stopped. Or maybe there's not an assumption, but it feels like there's an assumption that...
Additionally, that it's intentional is the assumption as well.
And that it's intentional, another assumption, yes. Something that's very interesting to me is that when I was reading what Socrates was doing, as he would ask a question that he knew they would agree to, and then use what they agreed to push them in this other direction, and usually that involved a slight altering of the definitions that the other person either didn't realize immediately or didn't realize at all. That is very similar to something that I learned about doing my senior thesis project at university, which is called learning transfer, which is a part of learning theory. Learning transfer is the idea that humans have the ability to take what they learn or know in one area and apply it to another area. Now, there are two kinds of learning transfer. There's high road learning transfer and low road learning transfer. Low road learning transfer is taking what applies in one context and applying it directly and in the same way to a new context. There's no complicated anything. It's just, I knew this here, now I'm going to apply it as truth here. Learning transfer, low road learning transfer. High road learning transfer is more complicated and difficult. It involves, I know this to be true here, but I can't directly apply it to this other area. Before I can apply it, I'm going to have to break it down into a more basic something, a more simple something, a more universal something. Then I can transfer it to this new area. That's called high road learning transfer. So if I were to answer your question, I would say, how do you protect against or defend against when people are changing definitions on you after you've agreed? I would say a step that people should take is asking themselves, is this legitimate learning transfer? Is this a legitimate learning transfer situation? Or is this a legitimate learning transfer situation? I guess you popped in and out, or?
No, keep continue. I just changed devices. Keep going.
Okay. Because sometimes it's not a legitimate learning transfer situation. There is no direct application from one definition to the other. There is no direct way, and there is no high road way. There's no way to break it down and apply the truth to the other area. It's just false. It's not learning transfer. However, I believe there are instances where it could be a learning transfer situation, where you could directly apply the truth to the new situation, or you could high road apply the truth to the new situation. And I say that because creating common ground is the first step that pretty much all teachers try in the teaching process, and that's because that's how people learn. The learning process involves our worldviews being expanded so that our perspective is changed. So I don't see what Socrates is doing in Gorgias to be necessarily nefarious or incorrect even. Sometimes when he gets a person to agree to one version of an idea and then he alters that idea on them, it's a situation where I believe the learning in the first circumstance can be legitimately transferred to the second circumstance. So in that way, Socrates is just educating them. And it's expanding their worldview so that their perspective is changed. And that's almost always what happens when people talk to Socrates. Their worldview is expanded and their perspective changes. They're being educated. To protect against the bad kind, you just have to know, is this a learning transfer situation or is this not? And that's maybe still abstract, but I did the best I could explaining it.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Stephen.
Okay. That seems fair. It's kind of complicated, but it's fair.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of these social science structure sorts of things that Stevens brings into the equation, but at the same time, even if you remove the structure from them, I think that there's truth there to be found, and of course the structure helps bring that out in many cases. So, Jonathan, would you like to summarize the responses maybe to your question and retort?
Well, as I was talking with Jacob about, or what I was just saying in response to his first response, I think that you can classify those responses to devious rhetoric between people who are arguing with you in good faith and people who are not arguing with you in good faith, or people who are maybe arguing in bad faith. And that's going to be at least as important of a decision-making tree as Stephen's claim of high road or low road educational opportunity. Because, for example, in a class, a lot of people just assume that you're going to be there to maybe not be disruptive or to learn in some way, right? And so that might be really close to assuming a good faith talk and discussion about the topics. If you don't have that, then interaction is going to be difficult. It's going to be limited. And as Jacob was saying, it may not exist at all. Or it may just break down. It may just stop happening and whatnot. So anyhow, that's a nice way to bring up all of that. I proposed that question more as I didn't think I was going to get specific answers a whole lot. I didn't think we were going to build an entire matrix on how to debate properly or something like that. But I just wanted that to come out and people to be aware of that, to think about that. If, okay, what happens if all of a sudden I feel like something's off in this debate? Or I feel like something's off in this conversation? Or I'm going a direction, now all of a sudden this conversation is going in a direction that I don't remember agreeing to. Or was that the definition that we really accepted? I think something went wrong. And that actually happens again. I keep going back to it, but that literally happens inside of Gorgias. That's how Paulus introduces himself and starts off at least his talks. And then I don't remember who's the third guy, Callicles?
Yeah.
He starts off in a very similar way too. He comes in and says, hey, look, Socrates, you're not being fair. You're not being consistent. You're getting these guys into these talking battles or maybe rhetorical battles with you, and then you're pulling the rug out from underneath them, et cetera, et cetera. You're not being consistent, whatnot. And with these techniques of like maybe begging the question or changing definitions, whatnot. So I just wanted to bring that up and say, let's be aware of that, of course, and it happens. I think it almost always happens, and it's almost unavoidable in any kind of discussion of maybe like two people, probably at least three people. Probably is going to happen at least a little bit within two people. But the question maybe to ask is this benevolent? Is this just an honest mistake? Or is this deceptive? So anyhow, yeah, I think that's, but good responses, boys. Yeah. I appreciate it.
Well, that's everyone's critical analysis questions, critical thinking questions.